Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vegas Legal Podcast. I'm Mark Fierro with Vegas Legal Magazine publisher Tyler Morgan, Fierro Communications Vice President Jeff Haney. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to talk about justice today. Joining us, Craig Drummond of the Drummond Law Firm based here in Las Vegas. Before opening his practice as a personal injury attorney, Drummond defended a truly interesting case. Imagine for a moment a situation where your client is charged with murder, but your client is supposed to kill. Your client is trained to kill those who are armed, trained to intentionally kill the unarmed, trained to kill anyone, in fact, who poses a threat to fellow American troops. Drummond served as defense counsel for a U.S. Army specialist, Craig Sandoval, an American soldier who was serving as a sniper in a part of Iraq best known as the Triangle of Death. Drummond's client was charged with murder. His client could have spent the rest of his life, every day of the rest of his life, in prison for pretty much doing precisely what the United States military trained him to do, and in this instance, ordered him to do. Drummond was successful in fighting back the most serious of the charges. I will say, this is not some little book. If you care about our people that we as Americans send to the Middle East to protect our country, and you care about justice, this is a very important read. Craig Drummond, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Excellent book, and set the stage, if you would. This is not middle America. This is a war-torn, one of the most dangerous parts of the world, and your client is sent out to look down a little tube and shoot at people who are threatening American lives.
Absolutely, and I appreciate the introduction, and it's a true honor to be here. Flying into Iraq is different than flying into just about any other country, because once you get over, even if you're on U.S. aircraft, once you get over Iraqi airspace, you don your Kevlar helmet, your ballistic eyeglasses, and your battle protective gear, and you're in a war zone. The planes could be shot at, the helicopters could be shot at. It's not a friendly place to be, and that's where I ended up in 2007. And landing there, I describe it best as walking into a blow dryer. And we got off a plane at midnight, and it was 115 degrees coming right at us, and a dust storm the next day, and that's Iraq. And it is definitely a war-torn country. It's been in wars for the past 50 years. Certainly after the U.S. got involved, by the time I got there in 2007, structurally there wasn't much left to the country. Mm-hmm. But we had all sorts of issues going on, and I got there right in the middle of what we call the uprisings in 2007, and that's kind of sets the stage. I was assigned there as a defense attorney, because in the Army, for the most part, if a soldier commits a crime overseas in Iraq, just as it was in Vietnam, just as it was in the Korean War, the Army will actually prosecute the crimes where they occurred. Some of the other service branches don't do that, but the Army does. So we will fly in a judge. We will put a jury in a tent. We will have that trial there. And it's done for a lot of reasons. One, the timeline could be done quicker, but two, all the witnesses are there. And so that's why the Army does it. And so when you do that, you have to fly in defense attorneys, and that's what the Army sent me over there to do.
You know, one of the things that was the cornerstone of this case is clearly, without any question, there were two crimes that were contemporaneous, just a few days apart. But in the one case, these are the cold, hard facts, and this is pretty much undisputed. There's some guy cutting grass, and your client blows his head off. Now, when you just hear the bare facts of that, you say, well, my God, put him in prison. But the reality of it is, if you're serving in Iraq and you're waiting to find somebody with a gun in your hand, you're not killing anybody, because the first thing they do is they hit and they run. They drop their weapons and they run. The clothing in this, tell our audience how important the clothing. This guy appears to be a farmer. He's just mowing his lawn with his sickle, but he's not dressed like a farmer, is he?
He's not. He's in what's called a dish dasha, which is a man dress. He's not in farming attire. And you're exactly right. I mean, there was no doubt in this case, and there was no doubt from day one, that my client shot the man. That was undisputed. The question is, why did he shoot him, and what were the other facts and circumstances? And you're right. It appeared at first glance, and it appeared initially to Army investigators that he was just cutting grass. But if you look at what was going on, U.S. forces in the area were being engaged right before this happened. Iraqi forces, coalition forces were being engaged. So there were a lot of other factors as to why exactly is this guy out in this field, in this outfit at that time. And those are kind of some of the things that we began to explore, as I call it, peeling back the onion of the case.
It seems to me the Iraqis, the bad Iraqis, the guys that have always hated America, they got to be laughing their asses off. This American who they came to kill is fortunate enough to see through it, shoots this guy in the head, now he ends up with his life on it. They have to be laughing their butts off. There's never been a country that takes their people, their forward people that work in the most dangerous situation, and says, yeah, maybe we'll take you away from your family until the day you die.
Well, you know, what's interesting, and I think you make some very good points, what's interesting is I don't know, the enemy in Iraq wasn't always the Iraqis. They had individuals flying in from all sorts of countries, all sorts of radicals coming into their own country, some good, some bad, some crazy. So at the end of the day, we to this day don't know the individual that my client shot. We don't have that information. We don't know his real name. There was a name given, but they could never support anything as far as how did you come up with this information. So we don't know if he was an Iraqi or what he was, but you're right. I mean, I think certainly the enemy, when we prosecute our own soldiers for doing their job, I think certainly that makes them have a good day, and that's not a good day that I'd like them to have.
One of the things that was so important to the setting is that the Americans set up on the single most important source of electrical energy. That's why they're there. They're taking this place is taking incoming mortar fire constantly. So it's not as if American intelligence has to figure out the lay of the land of the entire country. They know that there's an area mortars can only fly so far, and they identify a mortar crew. And the Americans' brilliant strategy on the ground, then when that mortar crew disbands, they watch the cockroaches. They're seeing where these guys go. And they give your client's team heads up. Hey, they're coming towards you. Here they come. Well, a few minutes later, here's some guy standing out there cutting grass. Some tells me he might be one of them. What do you say? Exact perfect timing, just right timing. And one of the things, and this should be a lesson to every attorney, every defense attorney in a civilian or military court or even in civil court. It was brilliant. You broke down. We think we know what we know because we're so trained. The sniper in the movie, that's the team leader. He's the guy looking down the pipe. He's the guy he's the junior. He only sees this little tiny hole, right? He's being led by somebody who's a commanding officer who's listening to a commanding officer that says it's okay to take the shot.
You're exactly right. One thing, and I try to outline in the book because I had served in the National Guard prior to being a lawyer as a military police officer, but I was never a combat soldier. I was a lawyer for the most part, and when I deployed to Iraq, I was a lawyer, and other than watching movies, I had no idea how a sniper actually works, how they operate. And lo and behold, as I begin to look into this case and I begin to look into Specialist Sandoval's actions, it's a crew coordinated effort. It's a two-man team. And it's the team where you have a shooter and you have somebody who's the lookout. And the lookout, the person who's either standing up or kneeling, is going to have the much broader vision. That's the person who actually determines who the appropriate target is. And I did not know that. I thought maybe a sniper worked alone, maybe the sniper decides who the target is. It's not that way at all. The sniper, once he's told who the target is, gets down, or maybe it's close, maybe it's from a ways away, and they're the ones who's just looking at that person. They're not looking at what else is going on. They're not looking at what other enemy or what other forces are doing. They're looking right down that scope, and when that observer or that spotter says shoot, their job is to shoot. No different, in my opinion, and what we argued in the case, it's no different than a piece of field artillery who could be a mile away.
Great analogy.
Where you've got a forward observer who's calling in on a radio saying, here's the coordinates, get it right here, and they fire the weapon. They have no idea what else is going on. All they know is their job is to get that mortar in that location, just like Sandoval knew it was his job to pull the trigger and get that bullet into that enemy's body.
So was that spotter involved in this case also?
He was. He was also charged with murder.
Okay.
He was charged. There ended up being 3 folks ultimately charged with murder. And the main event where Sandoval actually did shoot the individual, his spotter was charged, but the trials were all separated. And because one of the individuals, the third individual, ended up having a civilian attorney, so he was going to fly to Iraq, and the government didn't want to try the cases all together. They didn't want to wait, and so they said, who's going first? And I said, let's go. Because at that time, I think we had gathered enough information, and I have found sometimes it's good to wait on a criminal case. Sometimes it's good to just kind of wait it out, see what happens with the evidence. But other times when you think the prosecutors haven't talked to everybody, when you think the prosecutors aren't prepared, I say, let's just go. And my client was ready to go. And also I think the fact that he was serving time in pretrial confinement helped that. He was ready to go. He did not want to sit there one day longer. And when you have a client in pretrial custody, oftentimes waiting around is not a great option because they're serving time then. And if you think there's an opportunity to get them out, in my opinion, if you're ready, as long as you're ready, go ahead and take it. And that's what we did in this case.
So now that you're a civilian attorney, looking back on your days in JAG, what are there some noticeable differences as far as whether it's like burden of proof or the way the process works throughout the court system that maybe a lot of people don't realize?
That's a great question. In the highest level of the military court, which would be called a general court martial, which is what we faced in Sandoval's situation, the rules of evidence are almost the same as in a civilian court. You as a lawyer would walk in there and you would understand the objections, you would understand the judge's rulings. It would look the same. You have witnesses, you have a judge, you have a jury. It would look the same. The differences begin in a couple different respects. One, the jury has an absolute right to ask questions. Here in Clark County, some judges will allow juries to ask questions. In federal court, it kind of depends on the judge that you get. But in the military, the jury is actually, they have the right to do that. And in theory, although I've never seen it, they could actually call a witness. They could, we could close, the prosecutor could close, the defense could close, and they say, I want to hear from Colonel Snuffy or whoever, and they could do it. And the judge would have to say, as long as it's somewhat related, the judge would have to say, produce the colonel or whoever it may be, which that's a little different. The other main difference is that the same jury who is the trier of fact also sentences you. So that is a little different. So they would actually do the sentence. And what's interesting about that is if you get a jury who maybe it's an area where there's not a lot of trials, they may have no idea what the sentence is, versus a judge has an idea of what they're giving for attempt murder, or what they're giving for drug possession. This jury has no idea, and it's completely based upon the arguments of counsel.
What is it? Who's the jury made up of? I mean, when you're over in Iraq?
Jury's made up of military members. It's normally made up of officers, but it can be made up of enlisted personnel too, which Sandoval, as a specialist in the Army, was an enlisted personnel. He was not a commissioned officer. And so he was entitled to have part of those there. And so they flew in. Other combat troops assigned to the same general.
1/3 enlisted people?
1/3 enlisted. But that's the starting point, meaning we actually ended up having more than 1/3 enlisted in his case by the time we got done with the jury selection process.
What the most troubling thing out of all this to me is here's a guy, he's a young man, 22 years old when you actually go to trial, right? Not when
yes.
When the thing happens. And you back this up. Here's a kid that went into high school, and all he ever wanted to do was be part of the Army. That's all he ever wanted to be, and he wanted it for all the right reasons. He wasn't going to be some sort of heroic figure, although he wanted to do good. He was balanced. There's nothing to ever indicate that he ever bullied anybody. Wasn't that? And that kind of stuff shows up. After you get a bad shoot, they always go, it was always kind of nothing like that. Nothing like that. He had tremendous respect, even after all of this. He wanted nothing more than to stay in the Army, and then finally decided this isn't it, and found another route. He went into reserves. But to tell him, and to tell the artillery person, the F-16 pilot, we told you, go out and shoot them. Go out and do this. Go out and attack this site. Oh, we don't like the way that you did it. You're going to prison for the rest of your life. He actually could have faced the death penalty. The judge did not include that as a possible, or he very well could have.
The prosecutors would have had to posture the case differently. So by the time we got involved, he could not have. But you're right, for a murder charge, that is something that, if it's postured correctly and notice correctly is given, it could be a death penalty case.
And to be clear, I don't say that every shooter in these cases is right. Not at all. And do people go crazy? Yes. And when their friends get shot, do they go out and kill somebody intentionally for no reason? Absolutely. That's within human. I understand that. You should be charged for that. But that's not what happened here. There was a second case. There's a second case, and it was kind of the totality of these two cases that when I'm starting the book, I'm going, I don't know why this guy wrote a book about getting killed, because your guy's going to get killed here. But you did a great job. In the second case, they're out and they sleep in 1 hour shifts, right? Each guy takes a turn, and it's his turn to sleep. And he wakes up and there's an Iraqi national in his face. How did this happen? Somebody's supposed to be holding watch. And from his perspective, one of his crew members, the guy that's supposed to be on watch, is dead out of sleep. Tell us what happens after that.
Well, that's the second incident, and that's the incident where Sandoval, by no accounts, shot anyone. And they did it under a principles theory, which some of the people may be familiar with. It's more like a conspiracy theory. It's more like you didn't do it, but you had something to do with it. Mm-hmm. You aided, you abetted, that type of argument. Not always the strongest argument, especially if you're dealing with murder. The federal government, well, in a lot of places like to use it all the time for money crimes or something. Well, you deposit the money, therefore it's a conspiracy. Well, in this type of case, there was an allegation that after this individual walks up into this, it's a hide site, it's a sniper hide site where they're trying to hide and get some sleep. After he walks in, at some point, Sandoval said, shoot him, or something to that effect, is the allegation, which was never provable. It was more hearsay upon hearsay that even occurred. But you're right. I mean, the allegation is that they're all pulling security, and an individual unknown to anyone walks right up on them. And this is, and you asked me to set the scene, and the scene there is, this is the triangle of death. And this unit, the 1st to the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, a very, very honored unit from World War II, one of the more famous units there is as far as infantry in the Army. They're taking very heavy casualties. And this is a light infantry unit. These are not people driving around on tanks. These are walking.
They got nothing.
You are walking, you are humping it, you are out there, and you've got your weapon, and you've got your buddies. That's what you've got.
For a week.
For whatever period of time it may be. And to wake up in this situation where you're supposed to be able to sleep and you've got somebody here who you have no idea who they are, and your buddies are getting killed, that was a very nervous situation. And by all accounts, the guy was talking. And then he was taken into the middle, and at some point he was shot and killed. Sandoval didn't do it, and it was our position that we maintained throughout the trial that he actually didn't know what completely occurred in there, because once this gentleman walked up and once he starts making the noise, Sandoval and some of the other snipers, they pull perimeter security to make sure nobody else is coming.
For a reason. They don't disappear to disappear. You can't stand around in the middle of a war zone and start discussing things. He goes out to provide cover. He's going to shoot anybody that comes to this person's aid.
Correct. And now that they're making noise, that's a real possibility. It's a real possibility he could be an entire team. He could be the team leader. He could be the forward observer for this enemy unit. And that's what Sandoval did. And at some point, somebody did shoot this man. And it's sad that that's what happened, but Sandoval didn't do it.
The interesting thing that it's almost like one of those LSAT questions. He's the only guy that has a 9mm. Everybody's got long rifles. He's the only one that's got a 9. Somebody asks him to hand over the 9, but he literally goes to a hide where he can't see anything that's going on. He literally has walls facing out where the enemy could be coming from. This isn't just someplace in Iraq. The electrical plant that they're next to is platinum for the enemies of the Americans. If they can shut down electricity, America's got nothing to offer. And here he is in this hide. He's completely blind to what's going on over here. He's asked for his handgun. He gives it to him. That was the totality of his involvement. He literally can't see or hear what's going on.
That's true. He did. You're right. He did give a handgun because he was asked to give it, and that's so that they could hold this gentleman in the middle as quietly and as closely as they could. And he did give it, and then there is an allegation he said something about, shoot. But It was never proven, and no one ever testified to that. And in fact, the testimony trial was completely inconsistent with that. It was consistent with what you just said. He had no idea what was going on, and he wouldn't. He would have been focused on the outside. That would have been his mission. And he was in what's called it was a pump house, a brick house, little bitty pump house. So
with the wall blown off.
With the wall blown off, so he doesn't know what's going on behind him. He's pulling cover to try to make sure to protect, this hide site, and that's what he's doing. And he's charged with murder for that, for a second one.
Craig, what was the process of deciding to write the book and then writing it? In other words, when did it go from simply a fascinating case in your career to deciding you want to sit down and tell this story in detail in book form? How did that go?
That's a great question, and I don't know that there was one aha moment where I said, I have some great story here. I think when it was going on, the story about the case broke on the front page of the Washington Post, front page of the New York Times. So these newspapers, these national newspapers picked it up, and as the trial began, we had those types of reporters covering every day of the trial. And that had been a first for me. I had never, as an Army attorney or anything, ever had that kind of exposure and that kind of coverage. And the reporters who were covering it, they were all at first saying, well, this is just another case, and I think at first they all thought he was going to be convicted. And then as the trial testimony began, you could see every day, because we would all be in the same dining hall, all be in the same facility, they would express their frustration as to why this case was continuing after we were bringing in these more and more witnesses. And at that point I said, maybe I should keep everything about this case. Maybe I should keep all my notes. Maybe I should keep all these pleadings. Maybe I should keep them, because this is an interesting story.
In a way, you're the ultimate inside man in the whole case, almost start to finish.
You're right. That's exactly right. And so I kept it all. And then once I got back from Iraq, I started making some notes and said, maybe someday I'm going to do something with this. And then started writing the book. And then in 2009 is when I was leaving the Army and I was starting to write it. And I reached out to Specialist Sandoval, who's no longer on active duty, but I just wanted his permission. Not that I necessarily needed it, because it's not just his story, it's my story too, but I was his attorney, and I wouldn't feel right if I didn't have his full, that's fine. And he said, go do it. That's absolutely fine. And then it sat there for about 7 years, and I started my own law firm and built up employees and built up a business and didn't do it. And then finally my wife said, that book you keep telling me about, why don't you actually finish the darn thing? And so that's when we finished it.
Great.
In this case, the media actually played a pretty outsized role, because the New York Times, I believe it was, broke the story. Sometimes these crews are sitting out there, you get tired of waiting for somebody to do something in front of you. So they kind of chummed the site. They put bait out. Whether his crew was involved in it or not, that was never alleged directly. Nobody came forward and said this is what they did. But what they would do is they would drop a gun, allegedly. They would drop a wire that's used to set off improvised explosive device. And if you picked it up, you got a bullet hole in you. And because here's the proof. Here was the guy going for it. Now, once again, it didn't have anything to do with Sandoval. It didn't have anything to do with Sandoval's unit that was ever alleged. But it changed the nature of the environment of what you were up against, of what Sandoval was up against, because somebody in this case did, in fact, drop a wire and take a picture of it in order to sort of seal the fate. In this case, it was the would-be farmer that was out mowing the lawn. So it would look as if a little bit more convincingly that he was involved in some nefarious action. That couldn't have helped.
No, and it didn't. That is what broke the story, and that may be why the command, and what level and who I still to this day don't know, but what level of command continued to push these charges against Sandoval when the evidence, as we began to uncover it, wasn't consistent with the charges and wasn't consistent with the initial reports about what happened. And I think that's probably a large reason, because they have a public relations problem. And there were these allegations that it was baiting. They were baiting the enemy. They would throw out a weapon, and whoever grabs it, they're going to shoot them. And an interesting program, and I try to kind of tiptoe a little bit around it in the book as far as answering certain questions about it. But at the bottom line, it had nothing to do with Sandoval's shot, but it may have been the reason why these charges stayed there, and the reason why this young soldier had to face a court-martial that could have put him away for the rest of his life. And that may be a reason.
So let me ask the prosecutors in this case that were going after him, are they sort of in line with what you'd see in civilian courts where they're just very hung up on their conviction rate and everything, or is it because maybe they're also soldiers themselves that there's a little bit more communication between the two sides to say, let's not push this any further than we have to, because at the end of the day, this is one of our guys, and we don't want to see our own people in prison. But how does it work? I mean, is there different sort of level of understanding between the two sides in this JAG court?
Well, that's a great question. The prosecutors are representative of the United States government, so they represent the government in their deed, their action, and their prosecution. They report to the commanders. So unlike the civilian world where the prosecutors ultimately will report to the district attorney here, or the U.S. attorney, or the attorney general on the federal side, here they report to the commander, so the commanding general. Now there are different levels of attorneys above them who they report to, but ultimately whether to prosecute a case or not is up to the general. The attorneys don't have unfettered discretion like a district attorney would have a lot more discretion. They don't. Now, ethically, of course, if you feel like there's an ethical problem with prosecuting the case, a prosecutor could say, I'm not ethically going to go forward, but that didn't happen here. Whether or not these prosecutors believed in the case, I don't know. And I intentionally did not name them by name because I knew them. And I also had been a prosecutor in the Army, and I know how it works. And sometimes you can be given an assignment, and as long as you don't have an ethical problem with it, as long as it's, okay, I don't agree, but ethically I can proceed, your job is to proceed, even if you think the commander's just, completely off the wall.
It's got to be tough because given the situation, the environment and everything, looking at the stress that everybody's under, and then somebody, you got to figure it's more common than not somebody's going to have a mistake down the road, and then sometimes a mistake leads to just a catastrophic mistake like this incident. It's got to be really tough to go after your sort of fellow brethren in the corps,
And I think you make a good point. The converse to that, though, is it's really easy for a general to say, well, let's go ahead and charge them, and we'll see what the court-martial is going to do, as opposed to the general saying, you know what, I took another look at this, and I'm going to support my troops. And it may be a PR mess, and this may be on the front page of the New York Times, but I'm going to support what they did because I'm not going to second-guess them. To me, it takes more gravitas. It takes more leadership to do that, because that's the unpopular decision, as opposed to, well, we'll just send them in front of a trial. Any good trial attorney, prosecutor or defense, knows that anything can happen in a courtroom. People can get convicted of stuff that they were not guilty of, or at a minimum, you throw a million charges at them, the jury thinks, well, they must have done a couple. So they walk out of there with a couple of them, and it's just, it's not always the best arbiter of truth, and if you can find the truth before, I think it takes some, it takes a real leader to say, I'm going to make a change here.
He could have not had you, because I've watched the courts for a long, long time, and I'm telling you, there was you had some masterful moments. Here, take this. You want to talk about just pro forma. The prosecution ends its case. You throw up a bunch of, they didn't prove their case. They're just motions that you just write anything in hopes of getting something before the appellate court if your guy gets hung out to dry for 100 years. But in your case, you took apart the prosecution's case and made it very clear that there were a number of these charges that they could not sustain. It was one of the strangest things that I ever saw from the trial judge. He tossed a lot of the ones that he should have that were very, very clear, but some of the other ones that stayed in were still crazy as hell. It's almost as if we were looking at two different fact patterns.
I didn't understand a lot of his rulings, but I didn't understand a lot of his rulings, and you're exactly right. I thought it was odd that he did toss some of the charges, because that does not happen a lot.
No.
Almost every criminal case at the end, well, we don't think the evidence is proven, or something like that, depending on what the standard may be.
Talk loud.
Right. Well, exactly. Well, and everybody knows it's pro forma. Everybody knows nothing's going to happen with it. But he did actually toss some, but then he wouldn't toss others, and it was a little odd. But I think it was good that he tossed some, because here's what the beauty of that is. When the jury comes back, he tells the jury, oh, by the way, you don't have to decide these because they're gone.
This baloney.
It causes the jury to think, well, wait a minute.
Yes.
What happened? The prosecutor told me this is what he did when we had the openings, and now we don't even get to decide it. So I wish he would have tossed more. I wish he would have done other things, but I was fortunate that he did do something.
By the time the judge was busy tossing, what was your client left with at that point? Bring us up to date.
At the end of it, he was left with 2 murders. The murder for the first event, which was in April, the murder for the second event, which was in May. I would actually need to look back, but I think he was essentially facing 5 felony charges, 2 of them still being murder at the time that the jury was given the opportunity to decide of it. And one of them that he had tossed, which was pretty interesting, I think any lawyer would understand, is they had charged him with failing to report the murder. And I was arguing, well...
Which he had committed, supposedly.
Which he allegedly committed. So I'm like, well, I think there's something called the Fifth Amendment
Your Honor.
there. So, and the judge finally agreed with me on that one.
Yeah.
So,
There is, I can't imagine this kid, 22 years old, no life experience. From what anybody can tell, had never been in any kind of trouble before, and now he's every single thing that he's ever thought is right in this world, he's looking down the barrel of a gun over this stuff. What was your client going through at that point?
well, I don't know. I could only assume what he was going through. And I can tell you now, having written the book and having had some more conversations with him, and he actually flew out to Vegas for a book launch that we had, and I hadn't seen him since Iraq. Last time I had seen him was in a courtroom in Baghdad in 2007. But he and I talked, and we had a beer or two and chatted, and he had felt he had let his family down, and I think that was the hardest thing for him, because he was ROTC in high school. He really just wanted to serve America. That's what he wanted to do. And we had all these letters of support, very powerful letters of support from the community of Laredo. And for somebody who didn't come from this extremely prominent family, if you go back, I included the letters in the book, and I did it because I think it's powerful. It's to show how good of a family he came from and how much he felt like he was letting them down. And all these people who, even knowing the charges, were willing to write these letters, some of them school administrators, and I mean, high up people in Laredo who either knew him or knew his family, who said, I'm going to put my name out there about what's going on with this young man in Iraq, and thank goodness that they did.
I'm going to go off here, so get some water or something, throw it at me, because this is the part of I told you, I about threw the book, but then I realized I was reading it on my iPhone, so it wouldn't have been that good of an idea.
That would have been a real expense.
So here's this American, and you just heard the horrible straits that he's in. He's in this foreign country, and he's trying to rid the country of these bad guys. He needs help. And one of the things that he needs more than anything is to know that there is, at some point, somebody is going to come in and testify as to his character. Really, really important in these kinds of situations. It's his sister that's he's trying to get his sister in. He's trying to get his sister into Iraq so that she can come and testify. Probably one of the, other than you, one of the and his other crew members that really helped tremendously as well. But he's trying to get her into the country, but he's got to fly her into Kuwait. This American needs help, and he needs the help of the Kuwaiti government. Let's back up for a second. The whole reason that we went into the Middle East in the first place under Bush Sr. is because the Kuwaitis needed help. So we go ahead and we put this, what ends up being $1 trillion on the table, because we're going to go in and we're going to save Kuwait. We stage in Saudi Arabia. There's this guy, what's his name? Oh yeah, Osama bin Laden. He goes crazy over the fact that we're staging in the Holy Land. That's what leads to 9/11. 9/11 happens. We go into, for some reason, Iraq, which had nothing to do with anything, Afghanistan, which obviously had everything to do with 9/11. We go in, trillions of dollars. I think $5-6 trillion American taxpayers spent. Let's talk about 6,000 American servicemen's life. And they won't let this woman come in to help this American serviceman on their holy ground because she's a Mexican national. You know what? That's the Kuwaitis. Don't let anybody ever forget that's who the Kuwaitis are. That's what they did. That's what they think of American servicemen, and that's what they think of America. It pissed me off to no end. And like I said, I almost lost my iPhone.
Sounds like it.
But that's crazy. That's insanity. That has to be the most frustrating thing in the world. You can't get help because this country's not going to let them touch their land because it's a Mexican national? Wow.
Well, that did happen, and it was documented, and it was very frustrating for us when we were defending Sandoval because the judge had denied, the U.S. government, through the prosecutors, had denied her coming, and we got the judge to agree that we should have her there. We got the judge to say she's a necessary witness because, for two reasons. One, for sentencing, and two, in the military, you can raise what's called the good soldier defense. And it's completely unique, and that is one thing, and Tyler, I should have given you this example before, but I had forgotten, but there is one defense that you can raise in the military that you cannot raise in the civilian system, at least not forwardly. Good soldier defense, and what that is you could find reasonable doubt based upon this soldier's entire career. So, you can look at this soldier's entire career and look at all the good things they've done, and you may, based upon that, find that that in and of itself is enough to raise reasonable doubt as to whether they committed this offense. And in order to do that, we could bring in somebody who knows that. And we had brought in service members from his unit and things like that, but we can also bring in the family to talk about who this man is as a whole. And that's why the judge also agreed we could do that. And to have her, she was flown back and forth from Germany. It was like ping pong to try to get her over there. And ultimately, we decided, because we had what I felt was, and unfortunately it was, some good momentum, I felt like we should just proceed without her there. And so we didn't have to do that. But it was interesting about that because the judge was not letting the U.S. government off the hook. He was going to have somebody from the State Department come in and explain why the U.S. government cannot bring this witness in. But that was going to postpone the trial possibly days, if not weeks, so we went ahead without her. But yes, that, without me getting into the politics of it, I will just say it was frustrating defending them, knowing that the judge had said, make this person here. And I often wonder if this was a witness for the prosecutor, would we still have had the same problem, or could somebody have picked up the phone and said, hey, buddy, she's coming here.
Get it done.
So that was frustrating.
Well, the reason that I think the book is so important is that it says, the one thing that it's kind of counterintuitive, but because this guy is only looking down this pipe, he can't see the big picture. What he basically does is he sends that round. It's like, that's all he does. That's his only job. He's looking down a pipe, can't see left, can't see right. If somebody points a gun at his head, he'll never know it. He's counting on his team member. And his team member says, send it. We need to have some sort of legal protection for the person acting in goodwill that does what he's told to. Stand that model on his head. Guess how well things work when the sniper is down and they say, pull the trigger, and he goes, I don't think so. This guy's got the wrong color hair. I don't feel good today. I'm not pulling the trigger. He has to do what he's got to do, what he's told to do. And it wasn't just his team member. It was his team member's boss and his boss's boss that said, help clear this area. There are insurgents. They're coming your way. It couldn't be clearer. Is there anything that anyone can do to offer some level of assurance that this just doesn't happen to every single person that pulls the trigger, whether it's an artilleryman or an F-16
Well, you
pilot?
just send them to war with Craig's card in their pocket.
I'm telling you, yes, you'll get a really good attorney.
When in doubt, show the card.
I appreciate that, but I don't think my wife would like me traveling back over there. But here's what I will say. The Army saw that need after World War II, after the Korean War, when the Uniform Code of Military Justice in the 50s was actually modified to give people more rights. made it look more like the civilian system. A lot of people don't know that there were a lot of really generals who didn't like a soldier in World War II, and some individuals who were treated very badly for very minor crimes. It was very disproportionate. So it changed in the 50s. Well, the Army, though, saw the need for exactly what you're saying. And in 1978 or 79, they created the U.S. Army Trial Defense Service as a separate command. And that's what I had been reassigned to when I left. I was in Fort Bliss, Texas as a prosecutor. I was reassigned not just to go to Iraq, I was put under the Trial Defense Service command, meaning I didn't report to any commander in Iraq. I reported directly to a boss in Iraq who was a military defense attorney. And if he had a problem, he had a boss in Washington. And that's where it went. For lack of a better term, I could give two hooties, and I say it to Sandoval when I get over there that I don't care what the command wants. I don't care what the United States government wants. That's my job is to defend them. And so they created that, and they did that so that defense attorneys could have the independence. Now, I also think it might be interesting to ask in some of these cases, and we have this going on right now in over-prosecution of certain types of cases in the military, that when service members are found not guilty, I think whoever pushed those charges needs to explain why they still push those charges. Let's have a little accountability, because in the civilian side, you can sue. In the civilian side, you can sue under Section 1983 when somebody wrongfully prosecutes you and you're found not guilty. You don't have any of those rights in the military. But what about having the general or whoever is pushing that? What if they have to explain in writing why they still thought that was a good case? Because people are found not guilty a lot in the military, and there really are a lot of those. But I think we should ask ourselves, are we really doing the right thing by even making them go to trial? Or maybe we should say, why don't we just look at these a little better? Why don't we look at these a little more? Why don't we get out the pencil and sharpen it a little more before we decide to just send all these folks to trial?
So what happened to Sandoval? What was the bottom line sentence? Tell us.
Bottom line, he was sentenced to time served. He served a little bit more, 30-plus days. He was reduced in rank, but he was maintained in the military, and that's what's important. A military jury can kick you out, and they kept him in, and they said he could continue his service. And he stayed in, went back to Alaska, but some of his other friends had gone away, and a lot of friends had been blown up over there and been very much affected. And at the end of the day, the individual in the May shooting, the second shooting, he was convicted and went to Leavenworth for 10 years. So they had all of this going on, and Sandoval thought it was time to leave the military, so he left the Army, went back home to Laredo, Texas, was out for a while, and missed it. And he had a buddy in the Texas National Guard, part-time soldier, say, why don't you join? And he's joined. He's deployed again, deployed overseas again, deployed to combat again. He's a senior non-commissioned officer, and he's serving Texas and our country today.
Good for him.
That's great. That's great. So, what are you doing? Tell us about your work now.
I do a lot of injury work. We do about 90% personal injury, 10% criminal defense. Every once in a while, I will take a local military case.
Good for you.
Up at Nellis or Irwin or somewhere around here. I have a large staff and a lot of overhead, so I have to stay here. I can't go to Iraq or something.
Everybody. So the wife keeps you close.
The wife keeps me close. So, but we do that. We handle injury cases here in Las Vegas, and we're in court almost every day. I joke. I was in a suit this morning, and I changed. And we're trying to defend individuals who are wronged by other people, and that's what we're trying to do.
The Triangle of Death in southern Nevada.
The Clark County Triangle of Death.
Very similar, very dissimilar culture, very similar temperatures in the summertime. Saving Sandoval, a true story by Craig Drummond. I'm going to tell you an admirable piece of lawyering here, and a really fascinating book, a really, really great read. I was surprised. This is not a small book. This has some big picture issues in it for us. And
thank you very much.
We really appreciate you coming out and being on the show today.
Thank you.
And with that, we will call it a day. Tyler Morgan, publisher, Vegas Legal Magazine. Thanks for doing all the good work and bringing some great life to the legal community in Southern Nevada. Jeff Haney, Vice President of Fiero Communications, the friendliest public relations firm in town. And if any of you out there have a story idea, an axe to grind, tell your friends. You can call Tyler at
702-222-3476.
Reach out, tell your friends. We're out of here. Have a good one.